In this module, we will be looking for ways to answer the essential question, why are some places poor and other places are wealthy? We will decide if it has to be this way or if there are strategies that can resolve the problems associated with poverty from a geographic perspective. In this lesson, we will primarily focus on the geographic thinking question, what is where? So, in other words, where is poverty a problem? Where do we see patterns of poverty and patterns of wealth? Once we can identify where it is happening, we will begin to look for the reasons why. The first concept we will need to understand in order to answer our essential question is standard of living. Standard of living refers to the level of access people have to wealth. If there is a high access to wealth in a place, the standard of living is high. If there is some access to wealth, the standard of living is in the middle or moderate. If there is little access to wealth, we say the standard of living is low. What is standard of living? One way geographers draw conclusions about standard of living is by looking at qualitative data. Qualitative data is what we can observe with our own eyes and ears. In other words, we collect information by looking at images, visiting sites, and talking to people to find out what their lives are like. This week, you had the opportunity to draw conclusions about standard of living using qualitative data. You took a virtual field trip, visiting the homes of people and looking at their material wealth. You were able to draw conclusions about whether or not they were poor or wealthy based on what you saw. Another way geographers draw conclusions about standard of living is by looking at quantitative data. This can be seen by looking at numeric data, often collected by GIS and census data. In other words, looking at demographic indicators like infant mortality, literacy rate, number of hospital beds, gender equity statistics, all of these are numbers that can tell us how places have access to wealth. What are two ways geographers measure standard of living? In order to know where the places are that have high standards of living, we will want to explore some of these indicators in the form of choropleth maps. Most of the data sourced for these maps comes from organizations like the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and CIA World Factbook. All of these data sources are affiliated with government agencies, both US based and international. Let's take a look at this map. GNI means gross national income, and it's the amount of wealth produced by a country. Whenever we say per capita, it means per person. So GNI per capita is the total amount of wealth produced by a country divided by the population. This is not the same as per capita income, which would show the total income people receive divided by the population. So, in other words, it's all of the income produced by businesses and corporations as well as individuals. This is an excellent way of looking at something we call development. Development means how much access a place has to wealth. A country with a high GNI per capita has a lot of access to material wealth. And it helps to think of it as per capita because if we just were to look at the GNI and not take population into account, it would seem that smaller countries don't have as high of a standard of living or aren't as developed. So you must divide it by the population in order to get a really true understanding of development. So a country with a high GNI per capita has a lot of access to material wealth. In terms of this map's credibility, remember that 2016 is 4 years ago, but it comes from the World Bank, which is an international government organization who would have no reason to mislead the world about these facts. Where in the world, according to this map, do you see the highest level of wealth? Where do you see the lowest level of wealth? What would a high GNI per capita indicate about a place's standard of living? Why is GNI per capita a more accurate measure of standard of living than just GNI? So let's look at another indicator of wealth and poverty. With more access to healthcare, education, sanitation, and a consistent food supply, the longer a person is expected to live. In this map, we see places where life expectancy is high. We also see places where life expectancy is low. Where do you see the highest life expectancies? Where do you see the lowest life expectancies? And where does it seem to be in the middle? I'm just going to give you a minute. Now, in what ways is this map similar to the previous map that showed GNI per capita? I'm going to pause and let you think about that. What would a low life expectancy indicate about a place's standard of living? What would cause life expectancy to go down? Access to clean drinking water may be something that we take for granted, but in some places, few people have access to sanitation or indoor plumbing and clean water. And so life expectancy will be affected by the fact that diseases like cholera, diarrhea, dysentery, hepatitis A, and typhoid are more prominent as a result of having less access to clean drinking water. So, where do you see the highest percentage of the population with access to improved drinking water? You can even just point to it. Where do you see the lowest share of the population with access to clean drinking water? And I'm going to ask this question again. In what ways is this map similar to the life expectancy map, just in terms of the choropleth and the colors? And in what ways is it similar to the GNI per capita map? What would a low percentage of improved drinking water indicate about a place's standard of living? All right, let's talk about fertility rate. Fertility rate is a measurement of the number of children a single woman will have in her lifetime. In this map, which was created in 2015 but shows data from 1950 to 1955, we see that places where the fertility rate is the lowest is in Europe, North America, Japan, Argentina, and Australia. In these places, a single woman will have, on average, between 2 and 4 children. And again, that was in the 1950s. So this map is how things have changed since the 1950s. It was created at the same time as the last map, but shows GIS data from 2010 to 2015. So here we see that worldwide fertility rate has gone down. Places with the highest GNI are also the places with the lowest fertility rates. Places with the lowest GNI are also the places with the highest fertility rate. This seems counterintuitive. Why would people have more kids when they're poorer? Why would they have fewer kids when they have more access to wealth? Hold on, I'm going to cough and take a sip of coffee. So while you think about that question, what would a high fertility rate indicate about a place's standard of living? Okay, infant mortality. We're going to talk about that. It's a really, really sad statistic. Infant mortality is a measurement of the number of babies under the age of 1 who die before their first birthday per 1,000 live births. As you can see from this map, there are places where the infant mortality rate is above 100. There are also places where the infant mortality rate is at about 1. If babies are dying at a high rate, it is likely that there is not access to healthcare, sanitation, and possibly nutritious food sources. Let's look back at the fertility rate map. Okay, so if more babies are expected to die, it is more likely that women will give birth to more children over their lifetime. And this is in order to ensure that their babies will live past the age of 1. So there is a connection between infant mortality rate and fertility rate. What would a high infant mortality rate indicate about a place's standard of living? Okay, I want you to think about farms here where we live, okay, in our region of the Midwest. How often, when you see a farm, you drive by a farm, or maybe you even live on a farm or next to a farm, how often do you look out into the farmland and see people out there working in the fields? This is a real question. I want you to think about that. How many, just on average, do you tend to see out in the field? More than 50? Less than 20? Less than 10? Less than 5? None? Okay. Maybe you only see one person and equipment or industrialized equipment like the one you see here, this combine that you see. In places that do not have access to industrialized equipment and technology, human labor is needed for food production in order that people stay alive and have food. Because of this, you will see a higher number of people who have jobs in agriculture in places where the GNI is lower. So here's a map that shows this quantitative statistic. Okay, the title of it is Share of the Labor Force Employed in Agriculture from 2017. Okay, so again, development over time has led to the need for less human labor, especially in food production. So in this map, you can see that the places that you saw before in the other maps have the highest GNI: North America, Europe, Australia, Argentina, Japan, have the lowest number of people in a labor force employed in agriculture. So we're starting to see that connection. What would a high percentage of laborers in agriculture indicate about a place's standard of living? Now, one thing I want to talk about real quick when we think about labor force in agriculture, think about the pressure that that puts on that place to have children who can work the land with the family. If the family is a farming family, they need more children who are able bodied and able to work the land. So if infant mortality is high, there's more of a need for them to have more children to replace those that died, which is why fertility rate also is higher in places where you have a low level of development and a low level of industrialization. When we look back at this map from the 1950s, you can see that fertility rate was higher prior to the development of advanced agricultural technology. And that's worldwide. So as time went on and we developed more agricultural technology, we did not need to have as many children. So that's something to pay attention to. Okay, so let's get back to where we were. What is one possible reason why a place with a high population, like the United States, need fewer people employed in food production? Okay, we're going to talk about maternal mortality ratio. This is the number of women who die from pregnancy related causes per 100,000 live births. So we can see that the places with the lowest maternal mortality rate are in the very same places with the low infant mortality, low fertility rate, and low percentages of laborers in agriculture. Also, they're the highest places or the highest percentage of improved clean water and high GNI per capita. So, once again, we're looking at North America, Northern Europe, Australia, and Japan as the places that have the lowest maternal mortality rate. So I'm going to tell a little story. My father, who was a journalist and writer, wrote a book in the early 2000s, which required him to travel to a tiny little country, a mountainous country in the middle of Africa called Rwanda. Okay, it's a beautiful place. They call it Switzerland of Africa because it's all mountains and it's all green and it's a beautiful place. However, it is also the place where a horrific genocide took place in 1994. We've all heard about the Holocaust in World War II, where the Nazis exterminated the Jews and the Gypsies and homosexuals and anyone who was not part of their what they believed was their master race. But what we're going to learn this year, by the end of the year, is that there are other places all over the world where the same thing has happened. And in 1994, this happened in Rwanda. Almost 1 million people were exterminated by an extremist government. And we'll learn a little bit more about that in second semester. But what I wanted to talk to you about was when my father made his trip there, what he learned is there that for some people to go see a doctor meant that they had to travel on foot or on bicycle because they may not even have had a car for over a day or more. So in some of these rural villages, there was not a clinic or access to a doctor. But what he found was that in every single village, there was a church. So there was a missionary organization that he was following and writing about who was working to set up health clinics in churches. So, using that brick and mortar location that is already there. So, the infrastructure is already there in every village, and then doubling it up and being able to provide health services there in order to improve development. So, people could have access to health services to prevent infant mortality and to reduce their fertility rate. So this is a qualitative measure. The fact that I'm telling you this story is a qualitative measure of standard of living, and you can see that there are actions that are being taken to improve development all over the world. So this map, we're going to get back to the quantitative because this map will show you what I just described in the story of my father's travels to Rwanda. So, in terms of hospital beds, you can literally count them in order to draw a conclusion about standard of living. If there are many hospital beds per 1,000 people. That tells you that people have easy access to medical services. If there are a low number per 1,000 people, that means if people get sick, they don't have access to healthcare. Okay, so I want you to take a look at this map. If we literally count hospital beds and divide per 1,000 people in the population, we have an idea of how much access to healthcare a place has. Think about this. How many of us know that if we get sick, even with something minor like an ear infection, we can see a doctor who is within 10 minutes away? Okay. Also, think about this. If I took away the title and the legend of this map, and you were simply looking at the colors, could it almost be the same as the fertility rate map? Okay, so that's another indicator when people have access to healthcare, their fertility rate is going to be lower. So it is a true quantitative measure of health and development. Okay, what does a high number of hospital beds per 1,000 people indicate about a place's standard of living? All right, let's talk about literacy rate. This is a measurement of the percentage of people who can read and write in their native language over the age of 14. Okay. How does access to education connect to a high standard of living? So, we want to think about this in terms of places that have high levels of education. We're also going to see that people know how to prevent diseases. There's a more developed infrastructure, there's more innovation, there's more technology, there are more professionals, there's more medical professionals. Also, women give birth to children later in life. They're concentrated on getting their education first and then possibly having a career, and not so much on having children when they're young, thinking I'm going to die at a young age anyway. So life expectancy is higher and they don't need to worry about infant mortality as much. So you can see all of these things are connected. Another thing is when healthcare is readily available and women have a high literacy rate, you see that they have access to birth control measures as well. So that's going to impact their fertility rate. Okay, I wanted to tell you a quick story because a few years ago, I had a woman visit my freshman students and talk to them about a program that she worked with that was developing literacy in a country called South Sudan, which is a relatively new country. They've only had their independence for a few years, less than a decade. And one of the things that she said about this country, their literacy rate, first of all, is extremely low, but they also have very strict gender roles. The job of the women is often to go walk to get water for their family to use for cooking and washing every day. So often they have to wait in really long lines to get their water. This means that the places, the wells in the villages are places for socializing and finding out the latest gossip and the latest news about the village. So this women's organization called Women at the Well, and it's part of the Lost Boys of South Sudan and working on development. Her organization hires local teachers to provide lessons in reading and writing in their native language at the wells so that women can go home and then teach their children what they've learned. So it's kind of like sending ripples of development by giving them some education. And the goal, of course, is to develop literacy, bring up their literacy rate, and then improve their standard of living and development as a result. Okay, so what does a high literacy rate indicate about a place's standard of living? Okay, we've talked about women's roles. This is called Gender Inequality Index, or GII, and this is another indicator of access to wealth, believe it or not. So this index, it's a numeric index that measures or reflects women's disadvantage in three major areas: health, empowerment, or political roles, and jobs. And it takes into account maternal fertility rate, women in the workforce, women in elected positions, and then it has this numeric figure. So in this map, you can see that the places with the highest human development based on this index are North America, Europe, and Australia. Okay, what else do you see? Okay, where do you see the lowest human development for women? Okay, so we're making a connection. Places that have a low gender inequality index, the places with the highest level of development, are going to be the places where you see women who are empowered, women who have political positions, women who have jobs. Fertility rate is going to be low, and maternal maternal death rate is also going to be low in those places. All right, true or false? In places where gender equality is low, standard of living is high. Okay, so we've come to the end of all of these specific indicators, and now I want you to think about patterns. When we think about patterns of development, it's important to look at the big picture and think about what is where. Okay, this map shows something we refer to as the north south divide. If you were to look back through each map we examined from this lesson, you would notice the trends. The places with the lowest level of development tend to be in the southern hemisphere, with the exception of Australia. Why there? Well, we're not going to answer that in this lesson today. We're going to work to truly understand that when we talk about the history of colonialism and global trade policies over the next week or so. Okay, we will begin talking about places in terms of their level of development. And the reason why we used standard of living to kind of think about that is because when we talk about whether or not a place is developed, we're thinking about whether or not it has a high standard of living or a low standard of living. So we're going to think about these terms and use these terms in these vocabulary terms as we talk. MDCs are most developed countries, and these are the places with the highest standard of living. Notice on this map, the places that are the most developed are going to be the orange. So those are North America, Europe, and Australia. LDCs are going to be the places that are the least developed. Okay, so on this map, you can see that that is the bright yellow. So you're noticing that there are three other terms that are on this map. We're going to refer to the countries that are the MDCs as the core countries. Okay, LDCs, or the least developed countries, are going to be referred to as periphery countries. Now, semi-periphery countries are places that were once periphery, but they're starting to see some rapid development. And some of this is going to be due to government changes and policies, environmental changes, as well as economic changes and social changes. Okay, so the ESPN lens that we're going to look through will help us to explain why some places are developing rapidly, and those are the semi periphery places. Okay, true or false? Generally speaking, places in the southern hemisphere are more developed than places in the northern hemisphere. MDCs are also referred to as blank countries. True or false? Semi periphery countries are the least developed countries in the world. Okay, there was a lot in this presentation. So, what I need you to do is make sure that you understand everything. And the questions that I gave you were meant to check your knowledge and check your understanding. So, my expectation is that you get 100% on this Ed puzzle. So, meaning all of the questions that I've asked, I want you to get them correct. So, if you did not, what I need you to do is send me a message through Schoology so that I can reset the Ed puzzle and you can take it again. You need to take it until you get 100% in order to move on to the next task.